The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the grand ballroom. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and in that moment, I wished the ground would swallow me whole. My sister Rebecca stood frozen at the head table, her white dress pristine, her expression a mixture of horror and embarrassment. But it wasn't the broken glass that made my heart race. It was the sight of Colonel Harrison Mitchell walking through. Those double doors, his dress uniform impeccable, his steel-gray eyes scanning the room until they found mine. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. "Evening, General," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The word hung in the air. General, a title I'd buried along with so many other pieces of myself when I'd returned home to Denver 3 months ago. 6 hours earlier, I'd stood in front of my bathroom mirror, wrestling with a black cocktail dress that had fit perfectly 2 years ago. The B. Fabric pulled tight across my shoulders that had grown broader from years of military training, from carrying equipment across desert landscapes, from bearing responsibilities that most people my age couldn't fathom. My reflection stared back, Lieutenant General Sarah Catherine Wells, though today I was just Sarah, Rebecca's older sister, the family disappointment who'd abandoned her responsibilities at home. The drive to the Fairmont Hotel had been torture. Denver traffic moved at a crawl, giving me too much time to think, too much time to rehearse conversations I dreaded having. Rebecca's wedding was supposed to be a celebration, but for our family, it felt more like a performance. The Hendersons, Rebecca's new in-laws, owned half the real estate in Cherry Creek. Old money, old connections, old expectations about what constituted a proper family. I'd barely set foot in the lobby when my phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. "Remember what we talked about. Please don't mention, Today is about celebrating, not about your adventures." Adventures. That's what she called 15 years of military service. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, countless classified operations I couldn't discuss even if I wanted to. Adventures, like I'd been backpacking through Europe instead of leading troops through some of the most dangerous territories on Earth. The grand ballroom was everything Rebecca had dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across cream-colored walls, tables draped in ivory silk, centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The guest list read like a who's who of Denver society. Business owners, politicians, country club regulars who'd never worked a day in their lives but somehow considered themselves experts on everyone else's choices. I found my assigned seat. At table 7, strategically placed in the back corner, far from the family table where Rebecca sat with her new husband Marcus and his parents. The message was clear. I was family but barely. Present but not prominent. Acknowledged but not celebrated. "Sarah! Oh my goodness, look at you!" I turned to find my cousin Jennifer approaching, her smile bright, but her eyes calculating. Jennifer had always been the family's golden child, married her college sweetheart at 23, had 3 kids by 30, lived in a McMansion in Highlands Ranch, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how perfectly her life had turned out. "Jennifer, you look wonderful," I replied, forcing enthusiasm I didn't feel. She'd gained weight since I'd last seen her, but her confidence remained unshaken. That was the thing about people like Jennifer. They moved through the world assuming. Everyone envied their choices, never questioning whether those choices were actually enviable. "I heard you were back in town. Mom said you finally decided to come home and settle down." Her voice carried that particular tone, the one reserved for discussing family members who'd strayed from the approved path. "Are you dating anyone special?" The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to probe for weakness, to confirm what everyone already believed, that my life was somehow lacking because it didn't mirror theirs. I deflected with practiced ease, asking about her children, her husband's dental practice, anything to shift focus away from my own circumstances. But Jennifer wasn't easily deterred. Rebecca mentioned you're looking for work? Such a shame that the military thing didn't work out. But you're still young enough to start over, right? I mean, 37 isn't that old. That military thing. 15 years of service. Countless. Lives saved. Operations that would remain classified long after I was gone. Reduced to that military thing that didn't work out. I felt my jaw clench, felt the familiar surge of frustration that had become my constant companion since returning to civilian life. Actually, I retired with full honors, I said carefully. It worked out exactly as planned. Jennifer's laugh was like broken glass. Oh, honey, we all retire from jobs eventually. But what are you going to do now? Something more traditional? Maybe find a nice man. Start a family while you still can? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Rebecca's maid of honor, Stephanie, who air-kissed Jennifer before turning her attention to me. Stephanie had been Rebecca's best friend since college, and she'd never made any effort to hide her opinion that Rebecca's family wasn't quite good enough for the social circles she aspired to join. Sarah, right? Rebecca's sister? She extended a perfectly manicured hand, her engagement ring catching the light. I've heard so much about you. Rebecca says you just got back from… where was it? Afghanistan? Among other places, I replied evenly. How intense. I can't even imagine. All that violence and chaos. It must be such a relief to be back in civilization. Her smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for war veterans and homeless people, pitying but distant, acknowledging hardship while maintaining careful separation from it. The reception officially began with Marcus's father, William Henderson, taking the microphone. William was everything you'd expect from someone who'd inherited wealth rather than earned it. Perfectly groomed, supremely confident, and utterly convinced that his opinions mattered more than anyone else's. He'd made his fortune in commercial real estate, though everyone knew the real work was done by his team while he played golf at Cherry Hills Country Club. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today as we celebrate the union of my son Marcus and his beautiful bride, Rebecca Wells. His pause was perfectly timed, allowing for polite applause. The Henderson family is delighted to welcome Rebecca into our fold. She represents everything we value: grace, beauty, and devotion to family. I noticed he didn't mention strength, intelligence, or independence. Those weren't qualities the Henderson family seemed to prize in their women. The speech continued, with platitudes about love and commitment, but I found my attention drifting to the head table where Rebecca sat beaming. She'd wanted this her entire life. The fairy tale wedding, the wealthy husband, the acceptance into Denver's upper crust. And she'd achieved it, though the cost had been steep. The Rebecca I remembered had been curious about the world, had talked about traveling, maybe joining the Peace Corps. That Rebecca had been replaced by someone who spoke in careful phrases and worried constantly about appearances. When William finished his speech, the dancing began. I watched from my corner table as couples took to the floor, men in expensive suits guiding women in designer dresses through choreographed steps they'd probably learned at cotillion decades ago. It was a world I'd never belonged to, even before the military. My family had money, not Henderson money, but enough to afford private schools and country club memberships. The difference was that my parents had actually worked for their success, while the Hendersons had inherited theirs. The evening progressed with painful predictability. I smiled through conversations about golf handicaps and vacation homes in Aspen, nodded politely when distant relatives asked about my plans, and deflected questions about why I wasn't married with the practiced ease of someone who'd been having these conversations for years. But it was during the father-daughter dance that everything began to unravel. Rebecca and our father moved gracefully across the floor while the band played Sunrise Sunset. Dad looked proud but tired. He'd been working 14-hour days to afford this wedding, though he'd never admit it. The Henderson family had offered to pay for everything, but Dad's pride wouldn't allow it. He'd rather exhaust himself financially than appear unable to provide for his daughter. As the song ended, Rebecca returned to the head table, but instead of sitting down, she picked up the microphone. This wasn't part of the planned program, and I could see the photographer scrambling to position himself. "I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for being here today," Rebecca began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "This has been the most perfect day, and I'm so grateful to have all our friends and family here to celebrate with us." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on various tables, acknowledging important guests with subtle nods. When her gaze reached my table, she hesitated for just a moment before continuing. "I especially want to thank the Henderson family for welcoming me with such open arms. They've shown me what it means to be part of a family that truly supports each other, that puts family first, that understands what's really important in life." The implication hung in the air like smoke. I felt Jennifer's eyes on me, saw Stephanie, lean forward with interest. Rebecca wasn't just thanking the Hendersons, she was drawing a comparison, and everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant. My hands clenched in my lap, but I kept my expression neutral. This was Rebecca's day. I wouldn't ruin it, no matter how badly her words stung. Rebecca wasn't finished. She shifted the microphone to her other hand, her wedding dress rustling softly in the silence. The chandeliers cast a golden glow across her face, making her look ethereal, untouchable. "You know, growing up, I always admired people who knew what they wanted from life," she continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "People who understand that success isn't just about personal achievement, but about building something lasting, something that benefits the people you love." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Marcus reached for her free hand, squeezing it supportively. His parents nodded approvingly from their seats. The room had grown quieter, sensing that something significant was happening. Some people think that running away to distant places makes them important, makes them heroic. But I've learned that the real heroes are the ones who stay, the ones who build businesses that employ hundreds of people in their own communities, the ones who raise families and contribute to society in meaningful, lasting ways. The words hit like physical blows. I could feel my face burning, could sense the shift in the room as guests began to understand who Rebecca was really talking about. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth in mock surprise, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Stephanie leaned back, in her chair, arms crossed, wearing the smug expression of someone watching a long-anticipated drama unfold. "The Henderson family has shown me what it means to have roots, to build a legacy that matters. They've taught me that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stay exactly where you belong, with the people who need you most." She set the microphone back in its stand, the soft thud echoing through the speakers. Applause began, tentative. At first, then growing stronger as the Henderson family and their friends showed their approval. But I noticed that not everyone was clapping. Some guests looked uncomfortable, sensing that they'd witnessed something that went beyond a simple thank you speech. My father's face had gone pale. He caught my eye from across the room and offered a weak, apologetic smile. Mom was staring at her hands, her shoulders rigid with embarrassment. They knew exactly what Rebecca had done, and they were powerless to undo it. William Henderson rose from his seat, raising his champagne glass. "To Rebecca," he announced, his voice booming with satisfaction. "Welcome to the family, sweetheart. We couldn't be prouder." The toast rippled through the room, glasses lifting, voices murmuring agreement. I found myself mechanically raising my own glass, going through the motions while my mind reeled. 15 years of service, of sacrifice, of missing family gatherings, because I was halfway around the world ensuring that people like the Hendersons could sleep safely in their beds. reduced to running away to distant places. The band resumed playing, couples returned to the dance floor, and conversation gradually picked up again. But I could feel the sideways glances, the whispered comments, the careful distance that people now maintained from my table. I'd been marked, labeled as the family disappointment, the one who'd chosen selfishness over responsibility. "Well," Jennifer said, sliding into the empty chair beside me, "that was intense." Her voice carried false sympathy, but her expression was purely triumphant. "I'm sure Rebecca didn't mean anything personal by it." "Of course not," I replied flatly. "It's just that, people have been talking about why you really came back. I mean, military people don't usually just retire at 37 unless something happened." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Was there some kind of scandal? A court-martial?" People say a lot of things," I interrupted, standing abruptly. "If you'll excuse me." I needed air. The ballroom felt suffocating, filled with perfume and judgment and the cloying scent of too many flowers. I made my way toward the terrace doors, ignoring the curious looks that followed my movement. The outdoor terrace was mercifully empty, except for a few smokers huddled near the far railing. I found a quiet corner overlooking the city lights and tried to collect myself. Denver sprawled below me, a grid of lights extending toward the mountains. Somewhere out there was my apartment, my new civilian life, my uncertain future. Rough. "Night!" I turned to find a man in his 50s approaching, a rocks glass in his hand. He was tall, distinguished, with graying temples and the kind of bearing that suggested military background. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, but he wore it with the slight discomfort of someone more accustomed to uniforms. "Sorry," he continued. I couldn't help but notice the tension in there. "I'm David Morrison, by the way. I work with William Henderson." He extended his hand, his grip firm and brief. "Sarah Wells," I replied. "The disappointing sister." David's laugh was genuine, lacking the artificial quality that had characterized most of my interactions that evening. "Disappointing how, exactly? From what I could gather, you've had quite an impressive career." I studied his face, looking for signs of sarcasm or hidden agenda, but found neither. "You know about my background?" "Former military myself. Navy. 22 years before I transitioned to private sector consulting." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the city below. I recognized the look, that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to translate 15 years of military experience into civilian terms that people can understand. It was the first time all evening that someone had acknowledged my service without either pity or dismissal. "It's harder than I expected," I admitted. "It always is. People thank you for your service, but they don't really want to know what that service entailed. They're more comfortable with the idea of heroes than with actual veterans." David turned to face me fully. "What was your specialty?" "Intelligence, counter-terrorism operations mostly. I spent a lot of time in places that don't officially exist, doing things that never happened." I paused, surprised by how easily the words came. "I retired as a lieutenant general." David's eyebrows rose slightly. "Lieutenant general at 37? That's exceptional. Or suspicious, depending on who you ask." I gestured toward the ballroom. "My family seems to think I'm running from something." "Are you?" The question was direct, without judgment. I considered my answer carefully. "I'm running toward something, or trying to figure out what that something is." Through the glass doors, I could see the reception continuing. Rebecca and Marcus were cutting the cake now, posing for photos while their parents looked on proudly. It was everything she'd wanted, everything she'd dreamed of. So why did I feel like she'd lost something essential in achieving it? "She's terrified, David said quietly, following my gaze. "Rebecca?" Of what? Of not measuring up, of being found inadequate by her new family. She sees you as everything she's not, independent, accomplished, unafraid to take risks. In her mind, your mere existence makes her look small. He finished his drink, setting the glass on a nearby table. So she had to make you smaller. His words hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. You're very perceptive for someone who just met us. I've been watching family dynamics my whole career. Military families, corporate families. The patterns are remarkably similar. Someone always has to be the sacrificial lamb, the cautionary tale, the example of what not to become. David checked his watch. I should get back inside. My wife will be wondering where I disappeared to. As he moved toward the doors, I called after him. David, thank you for understanding. He nodded once, a gesture that carried military precision even in civilian clothes. For what it's worth, Lieutenant General, some of us know exactly what your service cost, and what it was worth. I remained on the terrace for several more minutes, letting his words settle. The city lights blurred slightly as unexpected tears gathered in my eyes. It had been months since anyone had used my rank, months since anyone had acknowledged the weight of what I'd carried for 15 years. When I finally returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The formal dinner had ended, and the party had become more relaxed. The older guests were beginning to leave. The dance floor was crowded with younger relatives and friends, and the Henderson family was holding court near the bar, accepting congratulations and basking in the evening's success. I checked my watch, 9:30. Still early enough to make a graceful exit without causing additional drama. I began making my way toward my parents' table to say goodbye, but I was intercepted by Marcus's younger brother, Tyler. Tyler was 25, fresh out of business, school, and full of the aggressive confidence that came with inherited wealth and limited life experience. He'd had several drinks, and his smile was loose, predatory. Sarah, the mysterious military sister, I've been hoping to meet you all evening. He moved closer than was appropriate, his voice pitched low and intimate. Rebecca's told me so much about you, all that adventure you've had overseas. I took a step back, maintaining professional distance. Tyler, right? Congratulations on your brother's wedding. Thanks. But let's talk about you. I'm fascinated by strong women who've seen action. His eyes traveled over me appraisingly. I bet you've got stories that would make my hair curl. The conversation was heading in a direction I didn't like. Tyler was the type who romanticized military service without understanding its reality, who saw female veterans as exotic conquests rather than fellow human beings. I'm sure you do, I replied coolly, attempting to move past him. But Tyler wasn't easily deterred. He caught my arm, his grip firmer than necessary. Hey, don't rush. The night's still young. Maybe we could go somewhere quieter, and you could tell me about some of those classified missions. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back at his face. You need to let go of me. Now. My voice carried enough authority to cut through his alcohol-induced confidence, but instead of backing down, Tyler's expression hardened. Come on, don't be like that. I'm just being friendly. You military types are supposed to be tough, right? The confrontation was beginning to draw attention from nearby guests. I could see heads turning, conversations pausing. This was exactly the kind of scene Rebecca would never forgive me for creating at her wedding. Before I could respond to Tyler's increasingly aggressive behavior, a firm voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? David Morrison appeared beside us, his presence immediately commanding attention. Tyler's grip on my arm loosened slightly, but his drunken bravado remained intact. No problem at all, Tyler slurred, his smile taking on an ugly edge. Just getting acquainted with the war hero here, though she seems a little unfriendly for someone who's supposed to be grateful for our hospitality. David's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Subtle, controlled. dangerous. I suggest you remove your hand from the lady's arm and step back. And I suggest you mind your own business, old man. Tyler's voice carried the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. This is my family's party. Maybe you should remember who signs your paychecks. The threat hung in the air between them. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat situations, my body automatically shifting into defensive posture. But before I could act, David stepped closer to Tyler, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Son, I've buried better men than you in unmarked graves. The only reason you're still standing is because this is your brother's wedding, and that lady there has more class than to ruin it over a drunk fool. But if you don't take your hands off her right now, I'm going to forget where we are. Tyler's face went pale. Whatever he saw in David's eyes convinced him that the older man wasn't bluffing. He released my arm and stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses. This isn't over, Tyler muttered, trying to salvage some dignity from his retreat. You can't threaten a Henderson at a Henderson wedding. I didn't threaten you, David replied calmly. I made you a promise. There's a difference. Tyler slunk away toward the bar, no doubt planning to complain to his father about the incident. I watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. Another scene, another moment where my presence had created problems for my family. Thank you, I said to David. But I could have handled that myself. I know you could have. But handling it your way would have involved hospital bills and police reports. This seemed cleaner. David adjusted his cufflinks with practiced ease. Besides, little shits like that need to learn that actions have consequences, even when Daddy's money usually protects them. Before I could respond, I noticed a commotion near the entrance to the ballroom. William Henderson was striding across the floor with purpose, his face flushed with anger. Behind him, Tyler was gesticulating wildly, clearly spinning his version of our encounter. Morrison! William's voice boomed across the reception, causing conversations to halt and heads to turn. I need to speak with you. Now! David sighed, the sound of a man who'd been through similar confrontations many times before. And here we go. Sarah, I'd suggest making yourself scarce. This is about to get unpleasant. But I wasn't about to let David face the consequences alone, for defending me. I'm staying. William reached us, his perfectly groomed appearance slightly disheveled from his rapid march across the room. Tyler lurked behind him, wearing a smug expression that made me want to demonstrate some of the combat techniques the army had taught me. I want to know what gives you the right to threaten my son at my son's wedding, William began, his voice pitched loud enough to ensure half the room could hear. Tyler tells me you physically intimidated him and made threats against his life. David's response was measured, professional. Your son was behaving inappropriately toward this lady. I simply suggested he adjust his conduct. Inappropriately? William's laugh was harsh, theatrical. Tyler was being friendly to a guest. If Rebecca's sister can't handle polite conversation without calling in muscle, maybe she shouldn't be at social gatherings. The insult was deliberate, designed to humiliate me in front of the remaining guests. I felt my temper flare, the careful control I'd maintained all evening beginning to crack. Your son grabbed my arm and refused to let go when I asked him to. I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom. Where I come from, that's called assault. William's face darkened. Where you come from? You mean whatever godforsaken military base you've been hiding on for the past 15 years? Let me tell you something, sweetheart. This is the real world, where people have real responsibilities and real consequences for their actions. The sweetheart was the final straw. I'd heard that tone before. Dismissive, patronizing, designed to diminish and intimidate. It was the voice of men who'd never faced an enemy more dangerous than a quarterly board meeting, who confused inherited wealth with earned respect. You want to talk about consequences? I stepped forward, my posture unconsciously shifting into, the command presence that had served me well in briefing rooms filled with generals and politicians. "Let's talk about consequences, William." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the band had stopped playing, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Rebecca was staring at me from the head table, her face pale with horror. Marcus had half risen from his seat, clearly debating whether to intervene. "For 15 years, I've been dealing with consequences that would keep you awake at night. I've made decisions that affected thousands of lives, managed operations with multi-million-dollar budgets, led troops in situations where failure meant death." My voice was steady, controlled, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I've earned every promotion, every commendation, every star on my collar through merit, not inheritance." William opened his mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. "Your son assaulted me, in front of witnesses, at a public gathering. Those are facts, not opinions. The only reason he's not face down on this marble floor right now is because I have enough respect for my sister's wedding to exercise the kind of restraint that apparently wasn't taught at whatever prep school you sent him to." Tyler had gone from smug to panicked, clearly realizing that his version of events wasn't holding up under scrutiny. Several guests were nodding in agreement. They'd witnessed his behavior, seen him grab my arm, heard his increasingly aggressive demands. William's composure was cracking. "How dare you threaten my family? I'll have you arrested. You'll what?" The new voice cut through William's bluster like a blade through silk. "You'll have a decorated war veteran arrested for defending herself against your son's criminal behavior." Every head in the ballroom turned toward the entrance, where a figure in military dress uniform stood silhouetted against the hallway lights. Even from a distance, I could see the insignia, recognize the bearing, feel the shift in the room's energy as 200 civilians suddenly found themselves in the presence of someone who commanded respect, rather than simply demanding it. Colonel. Harrison Mitchell stepped into the ballroom, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable. He was older than when I'd last seen him, his dark hair showing silver at the temples, but his presence filled the room in a way that made William Henderson's wealth and bluster seem suddenly insignificant. Behind him walked two other figures, in uniform, Major Patricia Valdez, whom I recognized from Joint Chiefs briefings, and Lieutenant Colonel James Wright, whose chest displayed enough ribbons to outfit a small parade. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft click of Mitchell's dress shoes against marble as he approached our group. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the analytical precision that had made him one of the military's most effective intelligence officers. When his gaze finally settled on me, I saw recognition, respect, and something that might have been concern. We'd worked together on classified operations, shared briefing rooms with senators and cabinet members, navigated political minefields that would have destroyed lesser careers. "Evening, General," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. General. Not Sarah, not Rebecca's sister, not the family disappointment. General. William. Henderson's mouth fell open. Tyler looked like he was about to be sick. Rebecca sat frozen at the head table, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, finally understanding exactly who her sister really was. Colonel Mitchell continued forward, his officers flanking him with parade ground precision. "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." The weight of Colonel Mitchell's presence transformed the entire ballroom. Conversations that had been buzzing with gossip and speculation died completely. Even the waitstaff seemed to move more quietly, instinctively recognizing the gravity of the moment. William Henderson stood speechless, his earlier bluster evaporating like morning mist. Tyler had actually taken a step backward, his face drained of color as he stared at the three uniformed officers. The Henderson family's money and social connections suddenly seemed very small in the presence of people who wielded real power on a global scale. "Colonel Mitchell," I said, snapping to attention despite wearing a cocktail dress instead of uniform. Old habits died hard, and the man before me had earned my respect through years of shared service in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. At ease, General Wells. His slight smile carried warmth reserved for trusted colleagues. I apologize for the unexpected arrival. We were in Denver for a classified briefing at Peterson Air Force Base when I received some interesting intelligence about your current situation. He glanced meaningfully around the ballroom, taking in the Henderson family's obvious discomfort, the scattered guests trying to process what they were witnessing, and Rebecca's frozen expression. At the head table, intelligence. William finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding boom. Colonel Mitchell turned his attention to William with the kind of measured assessment reserved for potential threats. Mr. Henderson, isn't it? I understand there's been some confusion about General Wells's background and qualifications. General? William's voice cracked slightly on the word. But she's just... Rebecca said she was... Rebecca said what? Exactly? Major Valdez stepped forward, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. Patricia Valdez had a reputation for being absolutely brilliant and completely ruthless when necessary. I'd seen her reduce full colonels to stammering children with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. Marcus Henderson finally stood from the head table, his movement catching everyone's attention. Unlike his father and brother, he seemed to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Sir, if I may ask, what is General Wells's actual rank and position? It was Lieutenant Colonel Wright who answered, consulting what appeared to be an official document. Lieutenant General Sarah Catherine Wells, United States Army, retired with full honors 3 months ago after 15 years of distinguished service. Her final assignment was Deputy Director of Strategic Intelligence Operations, reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread throughout the room. Deputy Director of Strategic Intelligence, Joint Chiefs of Staff. These weren't just impressive titles, they represented a level of responsibility and trust that most civilians couldn't even comprehend. David Morrison, who had remained quietly observant throughout the confrontation, allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Several other guests were whispering urgently to each other, clearly trying to process the revelation that the woman they'd been dismissing all evening was one of the most senior military officers in the country. But that's impossible, Tyler blurted out, his voice shrill with desperation. She's just Rebecca's weird sister who never comes to family events. Colonel Mitchell's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested that Tyler had just made a serious mistake. Son, General Wells missed those family events because she was preventing terrorist attacks, coordinating international intelligence operations, and advising the President of the United States on matters of national security. Her weird behavior, as you put it, was the result of carrying classified information that could affect the safety of millions of Americans. The colonel paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. 3 months ago, she completed a final operation that I'm not at liberty to discuss, but which resulted in the prevention of a coordinated attack on American soil. The president personally recommended her for the Medal of Honor, though she declined the recognition, citing operational security concerns. Rebecca had gone pale, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. The woman she'd spent the evening humiliating, the sister she'd dismissed as selfish and irresponsible, had been carrying burdens she couldn't even imagine. Furthermore, Major Valdez added, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, General Wells's decision to retire was not due to any failure or scandal, as certain individuals seem to have suggested. She completed her service commitment with distinction and chose to transition to civilian life at the peak of her career, something only the most exceptional officers have the luxury of doing. William Henderson seemed to age 10 years in the space of a few seconds. The man who'd been so confident in his moral superiority so certain of his right to judge and dismiss, now looked like exactly what he was, a small-town businessman who'd inherited his success and confused wealth with wisdom. We didn't know, he stammered. No, you didn't, Colonel Mitchell agreed. And rather than asking questions or showing the basic respect due to a combat veteran, you chose to make assumptions and launch personal attacks. At your son's wedding, no less. Marcus Henderson stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. Colonel, on behalf of my family, I want to apologize. Our behavior tonight has been inexcusable. It was a gracious gesture, and I could see why Rebecca had fallen in love with him. Unlike his father and brother, Marcus seemed to possess both intelligence and integrity. The apology should go to General Wells, Colonel Mitchell replied. Not to me. All eyes turned to me. The ballroom that had felt so hostile earlier now seemed filled with a different kind of energy, respect, curiosity, and in some cases, genuine remorse. My parents were staring from their table, their expressions a mixture of pride and shock. They'd known I was successful in the military, but they'd never fully understood the scope of my responsibilities. Jennifer, my cousin who'd been so smugly superior earlier, looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. Stephanie, Rebecca's maid of honor, was studying her manicure with intense concentration, clearly hoping to avoid drawing any attention to herself. But it was Rebecca I was really watching. My sister sat motionless at the head table, her perfect wedding reception transformed into something she'd never anticipated. The speech she'd given earlier, her dismissal of my service as running away to distant places, now hung between us like a toxic cloud. There's something else, Lieutenant Colonel Wright announced, consulting his document again. General Wells has been offered a position as Senior Defense Consultant with the National Security Council. The offer came directly from the Secretary of Defense and includes a substantial salary increase over her military pay, along with security clearance that exceeds what most cabinet members possess. The revelation hit like another bombshell. Not only was I not running from failure, but I was being actively recruited by the highest levels of government. The narrative that had been constructed about my life, the family disappointment-seeking, redemption, crumbled completely. Will you be accepting the position, General? Colonel Mitchell asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. I looked around the ballroom at the faces staring back at me. Some showed respect, others embarrassment, a few genuine curiosity about what my life had really entailed. But it was my family's table that held my attention. My parents, who'd worried about my choices for years, and the empty seat where Rebecca should have been supporting me instead of undermining me. I'm still considering my options, I replied carefully. The truth was, I'd been leaning toward accepting the position. The work would be challenging, meaningful, and would allow me to continue serving my country in a significant capacity. But I'd been hesitant about committing to another high-stress, high-security position when I was still figuring out who I wanted to be in civilian life. Tonight had clarified something important, though. I didn't need my family's approval or understanding to know my worth. I'd spent 15 years proving myself to people who mattered in ways that mattered. The opinions of social climbers and inherited wealth meant nothing compared to the respect of colleagues who'd seen me under pressure and trusted me with their lives. Well, Colonel Mitchell said, glancing at his watch, we should let you get back to celebrating. We just wanted to ensure there were no misunderstandings about your background or qualifications. He turned to address the room more broadly, his voice carrying easily to every corner. Ladies and gentlemen, you have the honor of sharing this evening with one of America's finest military officers. General Wells's service to this country has been exemplary, and her sacrifices have kept all of us safer. I suggest you remember that. The message was clear and unmistakable. Anyone who chose to disrespect me after this moment would be doing so, with full knowledge of exactly who they were dealing with. As the three officers prepared to leave, Colonel Mitchell approached me one final time. General, my offer stands. The position starts whenever you're ready, and the work would be significant. I nodded, understanding the subtext. Significant work. Important work. The kind of work that would make William Henderson's real estate deals seem like child's games. I'll have an answer for you within the week, I promised. The officers departed with the same precision they'd displayed upon arrival, leaving behind a ballroom full of people who were still processing what they'd witnessed. The Henderson family stood in a small, uncomfortable cluster, their earlier confidence completely shattered, and Rebecca finally rose from the head table, her wedding dress rustling as she walked slowly across the dance floor toward me. Rebecca approached me slowly, each step deliberate, measured. Her wedding dress trailed behind her like a white shadow. The designer fabric that had seemed so perfect earlier now somehow diminished against the weight of what had just transpired. The ballroom remained unnaturally quiet, guests lingering, at their tables, pretending to be engaged in conversation while straining to catch every word of what was about to unfold between the sisters. When she reached me, Rebecca stopped just beyond arm's length. Her face was porcelain pale, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the shock and something else. Something that looked dangerously close to fear. "Sarah," she began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that had always come so easily to her. We need to talk." The we felt presumptuous after everything that had happened, but I nodded toward the terrace doors. Whatever conversation was coming, it didn't need an audience of 200 wedding guests. We walked in silence to the outdoor space where I'd spoken with David Morrison earlier. The Denver skyline stretched before us, unchanged despite the seismic shift that had just occurred inside. Rebecca positioned herself near the railing, her back to the city lights, while I remained closer to the doors, a strategic positioning that wasn't lost on either of us. "You must hate me," Rebecca said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I studied her face in the soft lighting from the ballroom. My sister, who had always been the golden child, the one who did everything right, the one who never questioned the path laid out for her by family expectations and social conventions. Standing there in her $1,000 wedding dress, she looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her own choices. "I don't hate you, Rebecca," I replied truthfully, "but I'm disappointed and hurt." She flinched as if I'd struck her. "I know, God, Sarah, I know. That speech, what I said about running away, about real heroes staying home." She pressed her hands against her face, her engagement ring catching the light. I was so wrong, so completely, horribly wrong. Why? The question came out harder than I'd intended. Why did you do it? What could I have possibly done to deserve that kind of public humiliation at your own wedding? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with unshed tears. "Because I was jealous. Because I've been jealous of you my entire life. And tonight I finally had the upper hand, or I thought I did." The admission hung between us like a confession in church. I hadn't expected honesty. Not this raw, not this immediate. "Jealous of what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Rebecca, you've always been the favorite. The one who did everything right, who made everyone proud, who lived exactly the life everyone else wanted me to live," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be the good daughter? To never make a single choice that wasn't approved by committee? To smile and nod and agree with everyone about everything because that's what good daughters do?" She turned to face me directly, and I could see tears threatening to spill over. "You left. You joined the army against Dad's wishes, against Mom's. Tears, against everyone's advice. You went to places I can't even pronounce, did things I'll never understand, became someone important on your own terms. And I married the man my parents approved of, planned the wedding they wanted, and gave a speech tonight designed to make his parents like me better. The pain in her voice was real, raw, but it didn't excuse what she'd done. That was your choice. Rebecca, no one forced you to live your life according to other people's expectations, didn't they? She laughed bitterly. Do you remember what happened when I told Mom and Dad I wanted to join the Peace Corps? I was 22, fresh out of college, and I had this crazy idea that I wanted to help build schools in Guatemala. You know what Dad said? I didn't, but I could guess. He said that was a nice fantasy, but I had responsibilities here. That the family business needed me, that Mom needed me, that it was time to stop being selfish and think about others. Rebecca's voice grew steadier, stronger, so I stayed. I took a job at Dad's company, started dating Marcus because he was suitable, and slowly turned myself into the daughter they wanted instead of the person I was. The revelation explained so much about the distance that had grown between us. Over the years, I'd always assumed Rebecca was happy with her choices, content with the life she'd built. I'd never realized she'd felt trapped by them. But that doesn't excuse what you said tonight, I pointed out. You could have talked to me about this years ago instead of humiliating me in front of everyone. I know. She wiped at her eyes, careful not to smudge her makeup completely. I know, and I'm sorry, more sorry than you'll ever know. But seeing you tonight, watching everyone ask about your life, your career, your adventures, and then seeing how uncomfortable you looked, how much you didn't want to be here, it just made me so angry. Angry at me? Angry at myself. Because here you were, the person who'd actually lived the kind of life I'd always dreamed about, and you seemed miserable. And I thought, God, this is so petty. I thought maybe if I could make you look small, make your choices seem selfish, then maybe my choices would look better by comparison. The psychology was twisted but understandable. Rebecca had spent so many years justifying her decisions, convincing herself she'd chosen the right path, that seeing my obvious discomfort with civilian life had threatened the entire narrative she'd built about her own happiness. The irony, I said slowly, is that I was miserable tonight, not because of my career or my choices, but because I felt like I didn't belong in my own family anymore. Like everything I'd accomplished meant nothing because it wasn't what you all expected from me. Rebecca's face crumpled. Oh, Sarah, we did that to you. I did that to you. We stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of years of miscommunication and missed opportunities settling between us. Inside the ballroom, I could see the reception continuing, though the energy had shifted dramatically. The Henderson family was clustered together in intense conversation, probably trying to figure out how to salvage their social standing after William and Tyler's behavior had been so publicly exposed. What happens now? Rebecca asked eventually. It was a good question. The damage from tonight couldn't be undone. The things she'd said, the way she'd tried to diminish my service in front of everyone we knew, had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But she was still my sister, and despite everything, I could see that her apology was genuine. I don't. No, I admitted. This isn't something we can fix with a hug and a promise to do better. You humiliated me in front of our entire family, Rebecca. You tried to use my service, 15 years of my life, as a weapon against me. I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. She reached into her purse and pulled out a tissue, dabbing carefully at her eyes. Is there anything I can do? Any way to make this right? I thought about Colonel Mitchell's job offer, about the choice I'd been wrestling with for weeks. The position in Washington would mean leaving Denver, leaving my family, starting over once again in a new city, with new challenges. It would also mean returning to the world where my accomplishments mattered, where my experience was valued, where I didn't have to justify my life choices to people who'd never faced a fraction of the responsibilities I'd carried. You can start by having some honest conversations with Mom and Dad, I said finally. They need to understand what my service actually meant, what I actually did. Not the sanitized version you've all created in your heads, but the reality. Rebecca nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. What else? And you need to figure out who you actually are, Rebecca. Not who Mom and Dad want you to be, not who the Hendersons expect you to be, but who you are when no one else is watching. It was harsh but necessary advice. My sister was 29 years old and had never made a major life decision without considering how it would affect other people's opinions of her. That wasn't healthy for anyone. What about us? She asked quietly. What about our relationship? I looked at her standing there in her wedding dress, looking vulnerable and lost despite being surrounded by everything she'd said she wanted. The sister I'd grown up with was still there somewhere underneath all the social conditioning and people-pleasing. I need time, I said honestly. And space. Tonight changed things between us, Rebecca. I can forgive you eventually, but I can't forget what happened here. She nodded, tears finally spilling over despite her careful makeup. I understand. And Sarah, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you, even when I was too jealous and petty to say it. Before I could respond, the terrace doors opened and Marcus appeared, looking concerned and apologetic. Rebecca, people are starting to ask about cutting the cake, and my father wants to speak with both of you. The real world was intruding on our moment of honesty. Rebecca straightened her shoulders, transforming back into the perfect bride even as tears dried on her cheeks. We should go back, she said to me. This is still my wedding, and you're still my sister. Whatever else happened tonight, that hasn't changed. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I agreed. Some things, once broken, never quite fit back together the same way. Walking back into the ballroom felt like entering a completely different event. The atmosphere had transformed from hostile judgment to something approaching reverence. Conversations paused as Rebecca and I made our entrance, guests offering respectful nods in my direction that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. William Henderson stood near the head table, his posture rigid with barely contained mortification. Beside him, Tyler nursed a drink with shaking hands, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The powerful family patriarch who had dominated the evening through wealth and bluster now looked exactly like what he was, a man who had severely miscalculated and publicly embarrassed himself. Marcus approached us immediately, his face grave with concern. Sarah, my father would like to speak with you privately. He asked me to extend his sincere apologies for earlier and to request a moment of your time. The request was couched in polite language, but I could hear the desperation beneath it. William. Henderson's reputation in Denver's business community had just taken a devastating hit. Word would spread quickly about how he'd attacked a decorated general at his own son's wedding, and that kind of scandal could affect everything from business partnerships to country club memberships. 5 minutes, I agreed, curious to see how the man would attempt to salvage this disaster. William led me to a quiet corner near the bar, away from the bulk of the guests, but still visible to anyone who cared to observe. His usual commanding presence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the desperate energy of someone trying to contain a public relations catastrophe. General Wells, he began, the title coming awkwardly from his lips. I owe you an enormous apology. My behavior tonight was inexcusable, and I want you to know that it doesn't reflect my true feelings about military service or the sacrifices you've made for our country. The words were carefully chosen, probably rehearsed during my absence. This wasn't genuine remorse. It was damage control, an attempt to minimize the fallout from his earlier performance. Mr. Henderson, I replied coolly, your behavior tonight reflected exactly what you think about military service and about me personally. The only thing that's changed is that you now understand the potential consequences of those opinions. Winced, but pressed forward. You're right, of course. I spoke out of ignorance and pride. But I hope you'll consider that emotions were running high, and perhaps we could find a way to move past this unfortunate misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. as if his deliberate insults and Tyler's physical aggression were simply miscommunications that could be smoothed over with the right words. "There was no misunderstanding," I said firmly. "You made it very clear what you think of me and my service. The fact that you were wrong doesn't erase what you intended." William's face flushed, but he maintained his conciliatory tone. "Perhaps there's something I could do to make amends. A donation to a veterans organization in your name? Or maybe there are business opportunities where our companies could collaborate." The offer hung between us, a bribe disguised as goodwill, an attempt to buy his way out of the hole he'd dug. It was exactly the kind of solution a man like William Henderson would propose, because in his world, every problem could be solved with enough money applied in the right places. "Mr. Henderson," I said quietly, "you can't purchase your way out of character flaws. The problem isn't that you insulted a general. The problem is that you insulted someone you thought was powerless to defend herself. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." His composure finally cracked. "Now see here, I don't think you understand the position you're putting my family in. This kind of incident could have serious repercussions for all of us." There it was, the real William Henderson, the man who couldn't conceive of consequences that he hadn't invited, who believed his wealth and connections should shield him from the results of his own actions. "Your family's position is entirely your own creation," I replied. "I came here tonight as a guest at my sister's wedding. You chose to make it about something else entirely." Before he could respond, David Morrison appeared at my elbow. "General, I hate to interrupt, but there's someone here who'd like to meet you." He gestured toward a distinguished woman in her 60s approaching our group. I recognized her immediately. Senator Catherine Walsh, one of Colorado's most respected political figures and a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. "General Wells." Senator Walsh extended her hand with a warm smile. "Senator Catherine." "Walsh? I was having dinner upstairs when Colonel Mitchell mentioned you were here. I couldn't leave without introducing myself." The senator's presence shifted the dynamic once again. William Henderson straightened reflexively, his political instincts engaging despite his personal crisis. Senator Walsh was exactly the kind of person the Henderson family courted for their social connections, and her obvious respect for me was impossible to ignore. "Senator, it's an honor," I replied, shaking her hand. "The honor is mine, General. Your work with Joint Intelligence has been exceptional. I've been briefed on several operations where your analysis was instrumental in preventing significant threats to our national security." She glanced meaningfully at William Henderson. "I hope Colorado has been treating one of our finest military minds with appropriate respect." The subtext was unmistakable. Senator Walsh had heard about the evening's events, and she was making her position clear. William's face went pale as he realized that his behavior hadn't just offended a veteran. It had offended someone with direct connections to one of the most powerful politicians in the state. "Senator Walsh," William managed, forcing his political smile. "What a pleasure to see you. I was just telling General Wells how much we admire her service." The senator's expression remained politely neutral, but her tone carried frost. "How wonderful. I'm sure she appreciates the support of the community, especially given the sacrifices she's made on all our behalf." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Senator Walsh subtly reinforcing my credentials and accomplishments, while William grew increasingly uncomfortable. When she finally excused herself, she left behind a clear message. Attacking me meant attacking someone under her political protection. As the evening wound toward its conclusion, I found myself surrounded by guests who had spent the earlier hours avoiding or dismissing me. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hear about my experiences, my plans, my thoughts on various military and political matters. The transformation was both vindicating and slightly nauseating. The same people who had treated me like a pariah were now competing for my attention. Rebecca caught up with me near the coat check as guests began to leave. Her makeup had been carefully repaired, but I could still see the strain around her eyes. "Are you leaving?" she asked. I think I've had enough. Celebration for one evening, I replied. She nodded, understanding. Sarah, what I said earlier about needing time and space, how much time are we talking about? It was a fair question, and one I'd been considering throughout the evening's revelations. I don't know, Rebecca. Maybe 6 months, maybe longer. This isn't something that gets fixed quickly. And the job in Washington? I smiled for the first time all evening. I'm going to accept it. Colonel Mitchell was right. It's significant work. Important work. The kind of work that makes everything else seem small by comparison. Rebecca's face showed a mixture of sadness and something that might have been pride. You belong there. You always belonged in places like that, not here trying to fit into our small world. As I collected my purse and prepared to leave, my parents approached. Dad looked older than he had that morning, worn down by the evening's events and revelations. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from tears of pride or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. Sarah, Dad began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. Your mother and I, we need to talk, really talk, about your service, about what you've accomplished, about how proud we are. We never understood, Mom added softly. We thought we did, but we didn't. And I'm sorry it took tonight for us to realize that. I hugged them both, feeling some of the tension that had built up over years of feeling misunderstood finally beginning to ease. We'll talk, I promised. Soon. But right now, I need to go home and start planning my next chapter. Walking through the lobby of the Fairmont Hotel, I felt lighter than I had in months. Behind me, the reception continued its awkward conclusion, with the Henderson family no doubt spending considerable energy trying to repair their damaged reputation. Ahead of me lay Washington, a new position, meaningful work, and the opportunity to continue serving my country in ways that mattered. The valet brought my car around, and as I drove through the Denver streets toward my apartment, I reflected on how dramatically the evening had shifted. I'd arrived feeling like an outsider in my own family, questioned and diminished by people who couldn't understand my choices. I was leaving as exactly what I'd always been, Lieutenant General Sarah Wells, a decorated veteran with a distinguished record of service and a bright future ahead. Some nights change everything. This had been one of them. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.